welcome to Essay 6, Elocution, during which we are going to learn about the trope simile. And so, let's review just a little bit. You know that under elocution, we have been turning outlines into prose, into written sentences. You have learned about verbs and how to make them more vibrant and vigorous. You have learned about schemes, in particular, the magnificent scheme of parallelism, words and phrases and clauses and therefore sentences. And then you looked at antithesis to sort of develop the opposite forms of parallelism. And now we're going to look at a new idea. We're going to look at a trope. And so let me define two terms for you right off the bat. The first one is trope, even though it's second here. A trope is a transformation that appeals to the imagination. Under a scheme, you're thinking a change that appeals to the senses. It has to do with what you hear. It has to do with what you even see on paper. A rhyme scheme, for example, is something you hear. But a trope appeals directly to the imagination. And so that's what a simile is. It's where you change the writing to appeal to the reader's imagination and get him to see something similar between unlike things. And there's our definition of a simile. And a simile is an explicit comparison, a trope in which an explicit comparison is made of two things differing in kind but sharing a quality. Very important that they're differing in kind, not the same kind of thing. Often we say of unlike things, but they do share a quality. And an interesting sort of principle about thinking I've noticed is that if you can understand, if you can sort of enjoy this fact that everything in the universe is like everything else in the universe and is yet different, that makes a lesson like this a lot easier. But if for now that distracts you, just set that aside. I just love that fact. So when we look at a simile, we're looking at an explicit comparison of two things differing in kind but sharing a quality, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. Okay, so then what's the idea behind this lesson? What's the idea of this lesson? The basic idea is that by the time it's over, your students will be able to define, identify, generate, and add similes to their essays. And what I find very fascinating is that similes, when it comes to generating them, they sort of just come to our minds. But in this lesson, that's not how we're going to handle it. In this lesson, we're going to be much more intentional, much more specific, so that we can see not just that this happens in our minds, but what do we do in our minds without even knowing it? We're going to look at the inner logic of generating similes. Okay, so as you go through this, try to understand that maybe common sense is enough. Maybe that's all they need to do. But by learning to generate a simile, then they get control over it. They can practice it. They can do it when they're called upon to generate a simile. So what we're going to do in this lesson is teach them how to define, identify, generate, and add similes. And how will we do that? Well, the first step is I would recommend to you that you review the composition lesson from invention earlier, and especially review differences of kind, because we're talking about a comparison of two things differing in kind, and then review similarity because they share a quality. In other words, they're similar. They're both different and similar. That's why we call them similes. They're not the same, but they're similar. And then what you'd want to do, having reviewed that, is give them some examples so that they can learn to identify. And we've provided a whole bunch of examples in the teacher's workbook and teacher's guide. And in fact, I'll just reach over here and grab mine. And I go to the beginning of the middle of the lesson, and I see this from Homer's Iliad. Like a man in his helplessness who crossing a great plain. Notice, like a man in his helplessness who crossing a great plain stands at the edge of a fast-running river that dashes seaward and watches it thundering into white water and leaps a pace backward, so now Tydeus' son gave back. Like a man, so. And of course, that's Homer. You don't ask your students to write Homeric. They'll write something more like this. My cat is a pillow. That also is a simile. Okay, so those are examples. We start with, as the hart panteth after the water brooks, so panteth my soul after thee, O God. And what I want you to notice in those comparisons is that they're explicit. And here's what we mean by explicit. We actually come out and say, hey, everybody, I'm comparing. And how do we do that? By using words like or as, or even sometimes similes will use the word seem. So it's a comparison of unlike things in which you make it obvious that you're comparing, by saying like or as or seems. And that's why you'll often hear a simile defined as a comparison of unlike things using like or as. That's practical, that works. It's not a complete definition, but it works. So use that and show them how to identify by looking for comparison words and finding things that are different in kind. They are easy to find because all good writing is full of similes. And so you identify. Now, after they've learned to identify, you can ask them what it is, and we take you through the process of them stating a definition as they go through. But and they don't have to say it like this. They have to just realize that they're going to compare things that are different in kind, but have some similarity, and they're going to make it obvious with like or as that they're comparing. Okay, and so then, and here's the real practical part, the most important part, then you get them to generate similes on their own. Okay, now here's where we talk about the inner logic or the mental process that you go through. If you look on the board here, and I'm just going to erase the top, if you look on the board, you can see that I've made this little chart with term, quality, and different thing, and it's different kind of thing here. Okay, let me just erase this because I'm going to write up here in just a moment. But what you see on this chart is the logical process that the mind goes through to come up with a simile. What we do first is we identify a term that we're going to make a simile for. And here I've used a thing, bird. I've written a character, Atreus' son. I've taken a term from our essay, Edmund. Okay, now what I do is I ask, let's just look at one at a time, the thing, a bird. Well, what can you tell me about this bird? Well, the one I'm talking about here is loud. Okay, what else is loud? Can you tell me something that is loud but is not a bird, a different kind of thing from a bird? Well, a train is loud. Now, what you couldn't say is that robin is loud like a sparrow. That's just a simple comparison. But if I say that bird is loud like a train, you notice that I've said bird like. That X is like Y. Now, I don't have to say loud. I could say that bird is like a train. But for the chart, it's good to identify loud or the quality that you want to come up with another thing for. Another thing about the term. Now, let's go to Atreus' son, and this is talking about Atreus' son is Agamemnon in the Iliad. The character Atreus' son. Well, what do I want to feature? What did Homer, in fact, want to feature about Atreus' son? He wanted to feature his preeminence, that he was the greatest of all the military leaders, and he was mighty and powerful. And what else is preeminent? Well, in Homer chose an ox. In fact, he chose a particular ox above the rest of the herd. And that's a powerful image, isn't it? You can sort of feel the might of Agamemnon by that image. And so we have a term, Atreus' son. We identify the quality of preeminence, and we identify a different thing of a different kind, a thing, rather, of a different kind, an ox. Then we look at a third term in this case. We're going to look at the term Edmund because he's a term from the essay, and that's what they'll be asked to do on their worksheet. So I look at Edmund and I ask, okay, what is it about Edmund that I want to comment on? What am I thinking about Edmund? Well, in this case, I thought, that Edmund, he's unstable. What else can you think of that's unstable? I thought of a glacier melting, so I reduced it and I said, okay, melting ice is unstable, isn't it? It collapses. Edmund is unstable like melting ice. Or you could even say Edmund is as unstable as melting ice. And so that gives me a simile, and I've been able to put it into a sentence. That's how we generate similes. We identify a term, a quality about that term that we want to draw out, and something else that shares that quality but is a different kind of thing. Now, just a little note here, there are a few common forms of simile, and I'll just write those up here. One very common form for a simile is X is like Y. That's easy, right? Another common form for a simile is X is as some adjective as Y. I could say Edmund is as unstable as melting ice. Or I could say Edmund is like melting ice. Edmund is unstable like melting ice, or just Edmund is like melting ice. And in all of these cases, I am giving similes. Now, you could go as simple as telling the students to fill in the blanks in something like this, but that's not going to help them as much with the concept of generating. So we highly encourage you to use the worksheet and develop the generative form of this chart until they've internalized it and can come up with a simile really at the drop of a hat anytime they want to. One point I want to make here is that the further apart the two things are, the better. Don't be too demanding on this, but if they say something absurd that comes across as utterly absurd, that's probably good when it comes to similes. The bird is like the planet Mars. Well, how could it possibly be? Well, ask them to figure that out. But if they say something like that and can show the link, that's good. The farther apart the term and the opposite or the other thing are, the more powerful the simile tends to be. And so enjoy teaching this way by giving them the definition and then teaching them how to generate their own similes. And then having done that, they can add them to their essays. And you will see in the teacher's guide a number of examples. You'll also see in the student workbook a number of examples. But you can find examples of similes very, very easily in almost any book you read and online. So I hope that you enjoy both the practical benefit, the immediate practical benefit of this lesson, that they will be able to write with good similes. But I hope also that you can see the big picture benefit, that they come to understand the world they live in very creative and interesting ways, because everything is like everything else. And now they know the inner logic of generating similes. Thank you.